Statesman and patriot Daniel Webster once said that God grants liberty only to those who love it and are always ready to guard and defend it. Many men and women in our nation's history have answered that call, coming to the defense of our nation at home and abroad. Some have even made the ultimate sacrifice, giving their lives in the service of their country. Our nation's character has been steeped in their blood and sweat, and their stories intertwined with the story of a people, we the people. Joseph Pearce was born in China in November of 1842. When Pearce was 10 years old, he is reported to have been sold by his father for 10 silver dollars to a sea captain named Amos Peck. We cannot know for sure, but can suspect that his father's motive for selling his son was to give the boy a better life in a foreign land. If so, the transaction proved successful. Pearce escaped the uprisings and opium wars of his native country and was raised as one of Peck's children in a prominent Connecticut family. Joseph Pearce was 19 years old when he enlisted in July of 1862 as a member of the 14th Connecticut Volunteer Regiment. The company's first battle as part of the Army of the Potomac was at Antietam, the Civil War's bloodiest one-day battle with over 26,000 casualties. Many of the men in the 14th Connecticut were ill prepared for the battle. Most had never even fired a rifle. They fought bravely but sustained heavy losses. Those who did survive marched on to fight at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. The campaign continued, and by July of 1863, only 160 men of the 14th Connecticut were fit to serve at Gettysburg. Pearce was among the men in battle during the fateful three-day campaign.
The 14th Connecticut was positioned at the Bloody Angle, just to the right of the copse of trees, which was the focal point of Pickett's charge. On July 3rd, Pearce and members of the Connecticut 14th were engaged in going out to the Bliss Barn and farms. What the Confederates were doing at that point was using that as a position for their sharpshooters to pick off members of the Union Army. And General Hayes ordered the 14th to go out there, and Pearce was one of those that volunteered to go out there to fire the buildings, to burn them. And they lost 34 people at that point. And they returned back to their line along the Bloody Angle, thinking that nothing else was going to happen, that the rest of their day was going to be one apiece.
Within an hour, the events of Pickett's charge began to unfold, including the largest cannon bombardment in our nation's history. Some 15,000 Confederates charged the Union line, and Pearce and the 14th Connecticut were again engaged in the heat of battle. The tide would soon turn against the Confederates.
As their attacks started breaking down, Pickett's charge started dissolving. The 14th Connecticut leaped over their position over the stones, and they captured over 200 Confederates and 5 battle flags. From that point on, there was a retreat by the rebel army, and the 14th was engaged, unfortunately, in the task of bringing back whatever survivors that they could find.
For his honorable service, Joseph Pearce was promoted in November of 1863 to corporal, and was shortly thereafter assigned to the recruitment effort in New Haven, Connecticut. His efforts, along with those of his colleagues, must have been successful, for Connecticut had the third highest ratio of number of soldiers to the total number of citizens among states involved in the war. Only Iowa and Illinois ranked higher. Pearce rejoined his unit during the final campaign of the war, just before Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Out of the 1,040 soldiers to muster out with the 14th Connecticut, only 1/5 of the soldiers returned. Corporal Joseph Pearce was among this number, marching proudly in the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C., as the highest-ranking Chinese American to have served in the Civil War. After the war, Pearce settled in Meriden, Connecticut. He married and fathered 4 children in addition to taking up a career as a silver engraver. Additionally, he weathered the storm when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 to halt Chinese immigration to America.
And that act made it very difficult for Chinese to be citizens of this country, and also made it very difficult for them to bring family members over from China. Now, that act probably didn't affect Joseph very much because, again, he was brought up in a very prominent family. He was well accepted in his community, but it did affect his sons at later age. In fact, the sons never really spoke much about their Chinese heritage at all.
So what lesson is there to be learned from the life of Corporal Joseph Pearce?
What we could really take out of his life is the fact that the history of this country is made up of immigrants. He came from halfway across the world to come to America, which, because of the result of the Northern victory in the Civil War, made this country what it's become to everyone else, a land of opportunity, a land, a new birth of freedom, the last best hope of man. And that's what the lessons that we should know, the fact that this nation, again, is a nation of immigrants. It's a great melting pot. And it's a story about, fortunately for someone like Joseph Pearce, that is known, but it's also the stories of countless of other individuals that we don't know.
The Civil War tested our nation at home. After the turn of the century, another war would test our resolve abroad. One of the greatest American heroes of this war was Alvin York, who was born in the beautiful hill country of Pall Mall, Tennessee. He was the third of 11 children and grew up with a love for nature and hunting, skills that would serve him well later in life. By the time he was 16, York's father had died, and his older brothers had settled down with families of their own. He became the man of the house, which set him on a self-destructive path. "I got in bad company," York wrote in his diary, "and I broke off from my mother and father's advice and got to drinking and gambling and playing up right smart. I used to stay out late at nights. I had a powerful lot of fistfights." His mother was waiting up for young Alvin one night as he came home after drinking and fighting. She asked him a question that would finally change his life. "Alvin, when are you ever going to be a man like your father and your grandfather?" Immediately, York gave up smoking, gambling, swearing, fighting, and drinking, never to take them up again. Alvin York became a new man, as evidenced by his conversion at a revival in January of 1915. From there, York grew in a spiritual relationship, leading the choir, teaching Sunday school, and becoming an elder in his church. A year later, York was instrumental in starting the Church of Christ in Christian Union in his hometown. It seemed everything was going York's way. He was happy working the land and taking care of his mother and siblings. Plus, he had found love in Miss Gracie Williams. But his idyllic world was shattered when he received his draft notice to report to the Army for service in World War I. His newfound faith and counsel of his mother and pastor led him to file for status as a conscientious objector, a request that was denied because the Church of Christ in Christian Union was not a denomination of objectors officially recognized by the government. York reported for duty in November of 1917 to Camp Gordon in Georgia. He quickly won the respect of his officers and fellow soldiers alike, demonstrating a natural prowess for shooting acquired in turkey shooting matches and years of hunting back in Fentress County, Tennessee. Still, the idea of killing troubled York, so his commanding officer, Captain Danforth, interceded on his behalf to Major George Buxton. The major heard York's concern, and with his Bible, the officer gently argued that the Scriptures allowed for a man to fight to protect and defend his rights. Buxton granted York a leave pass to go home and pray about his future in the Army. York returned to his home and for 2 days retreated to his beloved mountains for prayer and fasting. There, York said, "I received my assurance that it was all right, that I should go and I would come back without a scratch. I received this assurance directly from God. and I have always been led to believe that he always keeps his promises. York returned to the Army and headed for France in May of 1918 with the 2nd Battalion of the 328th Infantry.
One night, me and Alvin were walking, and up from behind us come one of the boys leading a milk goat. He said, "Just going back to put some cream in my coffee." Alvin thought it was so funny, he told that story for days to anybody who'd listen. But maybe we needed to laugh, though, from time to time, just to get our mind off of the boys who'd been shot or gassed or blown up. And I asked Alvin one night what he did to get through. He just grabbed hold of that testament and held it up in the air.
The morning of October 8, 1918, turned out to be the most important of Alvin York's life. His battalion began an attack at dawn on a railroad line. The offensive required the men to advance through a valley banked on both sides with steep ridges occupied by the German machine gunners and infantry troops. York recalled, "The Germans got us. They just stopped us dead in our tracks. And I'm telling you, they were shooting straight. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machines at home." Something had to be done to silence the machine guns, and so York and a group of 16 other men were called upon for this task. The men formed a skirmish line, broke through a tangle of bushes, and surprised the Germans, capturing the headquarters of the machine gun battalion and taking the officers prisoner. Unfortunately, the German machine guns on the ridge continued firing and killed the other non-commissioned officers in York's battalion, making Alvin York the new leader of the remaining soldiers. Those who survived the assault took cover behind trees and bushes. York ordered them to guard the German prisoners as he launched a single-handed attack on the enemy gunners.
And we heard the strangest noise. It sounded like a turkey. It was gobble, 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 gobble. And come to find out, it was Alvin making that noise. And the Germans, when they heard it, they'd peek their heads up out of the machine gun holes to see what was going on, and Alvin would pick them off the second they came up out of there.
The Germans offered to surrender if York would quit firing. He agreed and took charge of 132 prisoners. After the armistice ending the war, York was chosen to return to the battle site with his division commander, General Lindsay, who asked York, "How did you do it?" "Sir, it is not manpower," the sergeant replied. "A higher power than manpower guided and watched over me and told me what to do." York returned to his beloved Tennessee home, married Miss Gracie, and fathered 7 children, each named after famous Americans. Andrew Jackson York is an interpretive guide at the Alvin C. York National Historic Site in Pall Mall, Tennessee. He preserves his father's legacy for future generations of Americans and lovingly remembers the man the nation reveres as a hero.
My father, he was a devout Christian, and what he's trying to do in his Christian experience, I mean, he's taught in different churches, traveled all around every state in the country, and he always had family devotion every night before he went to bed. And he raised all his kids up. Of course, some of them didn't go that way, but he taught them which way to go and what to do.
Despite a lack of formal education, York championed the cause for others. He founded the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute for high school students in Jamestown, Tennessee, that is still open today. York's life story was immortalized in the 1941 film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper.
But the movie, I don't think you'll ever see a movie as true as that movie. Only the first starting, he said that he was rougher than what the movie showed before he was converted in 1915. So after then, he turned around and he never did drink or smoke or anything anymore.
After the movie, York traveled and made speeches about the war effort. He suffered a stroke and spent the last 10 years of his life at home with his family before passing away on August 29, 1964. Son Andrew York puts his achievements in perspective.
some of them asked me, said, what would he think about the way the world is and not the whole United States is today? And you don't have heroes anymore. I mean, the heroes you have now is altogether different, you know. And back then, what he thought, he didn't want to take no money over what he'd done over there because he didn't believe in killing when he went. And I'd say that probably bothered him as long as he lived.
Unfortunately for Alvin York and others of his generation, he witnessed the Second World War erupt in Europe and spread to other countries, including the United States. By June of 1944, American forces were able to launch one of its largest offenses, the Battle of Normandy, otherwise known as D-Day. While the operation was ongoing, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation and offered a prayer on radio that captured America's reasons for war, as well as the nation's resolve to end it.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice.
One who did not return offered his greatest sacrifice in the South Pacific. Author and storyteller Rick Sowas recalls a man who, like Sergeant York, became an unlikely war hero.
Rodger Young was a short guy who loved sports. He could take a baseball and put it right where he wanted it, a natural-born pitcher. Football, he loved football. He was short in stature, but he made up for it with enthusiasm. And basketball, it was probably his favorite. One time playing basketball, though, his legs were clipped out from under him, and he came down hard on the gym floor, banging his head. He went unconscious, woke up the next day at the hospital, and found that he couldn't see as well as he had been able to before the accident, couldn't hear quite as well either. Well, he went on with his life, and as time went by, he volunteered to be in the Army. It was World War II, they needed good men, and they took Rodger Young into the Army. He was a good soldier, and he soon became a sergeant, in command of some of the other men. But you know what? After a while, he resigned from being a sergeant. He explained that he didn't want to be a sergeant because with his hearing not being so great and his eyesight not being so good, he was afraid that he might endanger the men in his command. So, at his request, they made him a private again, just an ordinary foot soldier in the Army of World War II. One day, he and his men were walking along through the green, dense jungles of an island in the South Pacific Ocean, when suddenly a machine gun was heard. It was a Japanese machine gun nest, and they were firing at Rodger Young and his men. Get down, they all said. They hit the floor of the jungle, and the machine gun kept firing. The men were being hit. They couldn't move backward, they couldn't move forward. Something had to be done. Rodger Young began crawling forward through the jungle on his hands and knees. When he got up close enough, he took out a grenade, not a baseball this time, a grenade, and he pitched it over toward the machine gun nest. He missed. The grenade blew up, but the machine gun kept firing at Rodger Young and his men. He crawled closer yet, took out a second grenade, and threw that one. Once again, it wasn't quite close enough. The grenade missed the machine gun nest, and Rodger Young crawled closer yet, but by now the Japanese had seen him. They turned their machine gun over toward where he was, and they began to fire. And Rodger Young took out quickly one last grenade, his last one. He threw it, and this time he hit the mark. The machine gun nest was blown up, and Rodger Young had saved the men in his squad. But as he had crawled that last distance, as he had taken out that last grenade, the machine gun firing at him, he had been hit, and his life's blood, his red life's blood, oozed out onto the green floor of that jungle there in the South Pacific. Rodger Young died in action, saving the men in his squad. Afterwards, his family was given the Congressional Medal of Honor, honoring what he had done, giving the family in his behalf the highest award that any soldier can win for being brave. Greater love than this hath no man, that he will lay down his life for another.
The call to defend liberty was renewed again in the 1960s with the Vietnam War. It is estimated that approximately 1,200 American military and civilian prisoners of war were captured during the conflict. Many suffered terribly as their Vietnamese captors did not abide by the Geneva Convention. One of these prisoners of war, Humbert Versace, was a West Point graduate and Army captain who surrendered his life for duty, honor, and country. Versace was an intelligence advisor working with an American Special Forces team and a civilian defense group made up of Vietnamese and Cambodians who were recruited to fight the Viet Cong. In late October of 1963, Versace received a report that the enemy was descending upon Licourt, a small town on the edge of the U Minh forest. An ambush was planned and the Special Forces team, along with Versace, staged their attack.
We had a good plan. Good bunch of troops when we hit the town, too. The Viet Cong ran just like we thought, but instead of running toward the forest and toward our ambush, they started running the opposite way.
What Rowe, Versace, and the other did not know is that they had actually fallen for a trap laid by the Viet Cong and were themselves about to be ambushed.
I never saw so many Viet Cong in my life. They had at least 3 platoons that we knew of coming across the paddy, and they just kept coming and coming.
A firefight continued between the Special Forces and the Viet Cong. The Americans were nearing surrender when both Captain Rocky Versace and Lieutenant James Rowe were injured.
I remember Rocky caught 3 rounds in the leg, and if he hadn't fallen at that moment, he would have bought it right then and there because we had gotten a grenade thrown at us. And I remember the grenade blast caught me in the face and chest as I was stepping over to help him. I thought I was dead. All I heard was a ringing noise and then nothing. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't feel any pain. It was just nothing but numbness. And I tried to get up, but everything was just spinning around, and I went back down on my knees. And I remember Rocky putting his arms around my neck, and I tried to drag him off the trail so we could wait it out until the enemy passed us. And I was starting to put a compress on his leg, and that's when we got captured.
Versace, along with Rowe and Sergeant First Class Daniel Pitzer, were bound by their Viet Cong captors and led through the U Minh forest. The Viet Cong considered the soldiers to be war criminals and therefore not subject to the same treatment as POWs. Despite his captors' inhumane treatment, the only information Versace ever provided to the Viet Cong was what was required by his military code of conduct: name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. For his open defiance of the Viet Cong, Captain Versace was separated from the other prisoners and placed in a bamboo isolation cage. He was kept in leg irons, lying flat on his back in a cell that was only 3 foot high and 2 feet wide. Versace was only let out to eat and use the latrine, but he made the most of these opportunities, passing notes to the other prisoners and singing loudly to encourage the other men. According to a guard at the prison camp, Versace escaped 4 times, but was recaptured in each attempt and was punished with decreased rations of food and various forms of torture.
I remember once when Rocky told our captors that as long as he was true to God and true to himself, what was waiting for him after this life was far better than anything that could happen now. You know, he told him they might as well kill him right then and there because he wasn't going to give him anything but his name, rank, and serial number.
Unfortunately, the Viet Cong did just that, announcing on September 29, 1965, that Captain Versace had been executed in reprisal for actions of the South Vietnamese government.
You know, the one moment that really stands out the most for me was one night when I heard Rocky singing. He was singing "God Bless America" at the top of his lungs. And it turned out to be the last time we'd ever hear him. When I think back on it, I realize that Rocky walked his own path. I mean, we all did. But for him, duty, honor, and country were a way of life. I mean, he was the finest example of an officer that I've ever known. I mean, to him, it was a matter of liberty or death, and he wouldn't have it any other way. And I know that he valued that one moment of honor more than he would have a lifetime of compromises.
In a speech given at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in 1941, Sergeant Alvin York said, "Liberty and freedom and democracy are so very precious that you do not fight to win them once and stop. Liberty, freedom, and democracy are prizes awarded to the people who fight to win them and then keep fighting eternally to hold them." We enjoy liberty and freedom and democracy today thanks to individuals such as Joseph Pearce, Alvin York, Rodger Young, Humbert Versace, and countless others who have fought and in some cases sacrificed their lives for our great nation's common defense.